There's one major aspect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has gone overlooked, and that's the impact that Ukrainian partisans have had. These guerrilla warriors, or insurgents depending on how you view them, have been actively harassing and hampering Russian forces since the start of their invasion. Let's analyze how effective these partisan operations have been so far, why Putin weirdly used them as a justification to start his invasion 1 year ago, and what exactly is the Russian retaliation strategy. While the city of Kherson was occupied by Russian forces, on April 21, 2022, it was reported that partisans there left a banner with a message on a pole in the city that read, "Russian occupier and everyone who supports their regime, we are close, we are already working in Kherson, death awaits you all. Kherson is Ukraine." This is exactly the kind of leaflet that is right out of the partisan warfare playbook to make sure an occupation force knows they're being watched. When I was in Iraq, insurgents would leave these leaflets all over the city that we occupied. Ukrainian partisans were a major reason why Putin was forced to withdraw his forces from the strategically important city of Kherson in November 2022. A civilian informant, codenamed Dollar, was operating inside the city at the time. His network consisted of only 4 people. Dollar observed Russian armed security were drawing attention to themselves, clearly standing guard outside the Hotel Ninyel in Kherson. This was an unusual sight and stuck out to him. They must be protecting some high-valued Russian FSB officer stationed at this headquarters. Dollar reported this intelligence to his Ukrainian Special Forces handler via an encrypted app on his phone. Then, right before sunrise on October 5th, a huge explosion went off in the hotel, taking out 2 Russian Special Forces officers and 7 Russian military officials. Soon afterwards, Russian command would determine that they were unable to protect their high-ranking officials in the city and withdrew from Kherson. According to Russian FSB case documents, Ukrainian handlers usually offer $800 per month to carry out operations inside Russian-occupied territory. For the price of less than 1 AK-47, Ukraine was able to take out 6 high-valued Russian officers that were very difficult for them to replace. These tactics are straight out of the US Army's Special Forces Doctrine for Guerrilla Warfare, FM 3121, which we know US operators taught to Ukrainians prior to the invasion. Multiple attacks by small units over a wide area may be launched against related targets. This tends to deceive the enemy as to the location of guerrilla bases, causes him to overestimate guerrilla strength, and forces him to disperse his security forces. Initial attacks may be timed to draw security forces away from critical or more heavily defended targets, or into an ambush. What this means is we could look out for locations where there's increasing partisan attacks as a possible hint to where Ukraine's new counteroffensive may take place, especially since the majority of the population of Melitopol is strongly against Russian presence. This is one of the cities that analysts believe would be the most likely for a new Ukrainian counteroffensive to cut Russia's land bridge in half, and the partisan activity there is a huge help towards this strategic goal. Early in the war in Ukraine, the mayor of the Russian-occupied Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, said that according to their intelligence, Ukrainian partisan troops had taken out 100 Russian soldiers in the city within just 1 month after the invasion. They did this mainly through ambushes on patrols. It's interesting to note that Ukraine has a long history of partisan operations against occupiers, and it's possibly this very legacy that Putin tried to revive and use as justification for labeling Ukrainian leadership as Nazis. Because Ukraine's post-World War II resistance against the Soviet Union and the Poles was originally led by a group called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was a far-right group that had worked with the Germans and actually held on long enough to also receive support from the American CIA. This insurgency was able to successfully eliminate a huge number of 35,000 Soviet soldiers, police, and Communist Party officials during the post-war era, according to the CIA. The group once held 20,000 members, but today is completely defunct. Despite this, Putin still uses it as part of his justification for invading Ukraine. However, Ukrainian partisanship today against Putin and his invasion looks very different. A law passed 2 years ago in Ukraine authorized their special forces operators to train, arm, and even directly pay covert fighters on Ukrainian territory during wartime. Partisan resistant groups were established months before the invasion and action began as early as a week after the initial invasion, when the pro-Russian mayor of the city of Kremenaya in the Luhansk region was abducted and later killed. According to an advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs in Ukraine, this action was done by unknown patriots. This fierce pushback is not what Putin expected, because by many accounts, Russia believed they would be welcomed into the Russian-speaking eastern part of the country, which of course was not the case. While regular troops are utilized on the front lines and are involved in the day-to-day fighting, partisans are active behind the lines, deep inside of Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine, and are actively sabotaging their Russian occupiers. We will see they can be civilians with a simple rifle, or a Ukrainian Special Forces operator planning a coordinated, complex attack. Their main focus has been on intelligence operations, targeted assassinations. Even grandmas are getting into the fight, like this grandma who laced the pie with poison and took out 8 Russian soldiers. But this is just the tip of the partisan iceberg. But before we get into that, this video is sponsored by Wondrium. If you want to get a better understanding of national security than I could ever hope to give you in just a short video, then you'll want to watch former National Security Advisor and U.S. Army General H.R. McMaster's lecture on assessing America's national security threats, specifically episode 2 on Vladimir Putin's Russian playbook. Many of my videos are based on research done from this series, and now you can watch it in its entirety with our partner Wondrium. Wondrium is a premier, entertaining, and educational video subscription. By the end of this lecture series, you'll have a better understanding of the motivations and worldviews of US adversaries. Wondrium searches far and wide to bring you trusted, respected, and inspiring experts and nonfiction storytellers who have led thousands of hours of video courses, documentaries, and series. Wondrium continues to add new content to their platform each and every month. There's always a new interesting topic to jump into. So why spend your nights watching mind-numbing content when you could be discovering new passions? They're offering my viewers a free trial subscription now to wondrium.com/taskandpurpose, or click the link in the description below to start your free trial today. It's important to understand that anyone in these occupied regions can fall under the partisan umbrella. According to one Ukrainian intelligence handler, partisans can be anyone from a taxi driver, dedicated resistance cells, or ordinary citizens just trying to live their lives. No matter their origin, there are individuals who are willing to take the risk and create resistance against the Russian occupation, many of whom are military veterans who fought in Ukraine against Russia since 2014. A small number of professional partisans who are Ukrainian Special Forces are embedded behind enemy lines in order to organize partisan attacks in places like Crimea. One Ukrainian partisan fighter, codenamed Savrog, spoke to the New York Times and explained perfectly the purpose of these attacks. Quote, "The goal is to show the occupier that they are not at home, that they should not settle in, that they should not sleep comfortably." I've been on the other end of facing resistance fighters when I was deployed to Iraq, and I can say firsthand that facing this kind of resistance is incredibly demoralizing and frustrating. Frequently, the attacks come when you think you're safe, and then they vanish before you have a chance to retaliate. The key aspect here is the psychological impact that partisan action has on regular Russian troops who are never given a moment's rest. The Ukrainian government directly supports guerrilla warfare by setting up a dedicated website for them called the National Resistance Center of Ukraine. I'll put a link in the description so you guys can check it out. The site lets anyone who wants to help fight the Russians have numerous resources to do so, such as a tip hotline on Russian military positions, ways to perform non-violent resistance, and even instructions on how to fire an RPG correctly. Government support included weapons being handed out to those who were willing to take them, and civilians who were willing to make Molotov cocktails as makeshift weapons. In a Twitter post only 2 days after the initial invasion, Ukraine's interior minister stated that Kiev had handed out more than 25,000 rifles, 10 million bullets, numerous RPGs and grenades were distributed to those who were willing to take them. Evidence this was successful comes from a post last December where partisans were congratulated for providing intelligence that enabled a strike in an occupied school that destroyed 12 Russian military vehicles, killed 16 soldiers, and injured 40. This encouragement and availability of resources has undoubtedly led to better operational effectiveness to those who are willing to take the high risk. James Dobbins, Senior Fellow, Distinguished Chair in Diplomacy and Security, stated in his RAND article that a force as large as 800,000 Russian soldiers and police might be required to fully pacify all of Ukraine. That is 5 times the number Russia has currently deployed. Finding a concrete number of Ukrainians who are partisans is extremely difficult, as any number provided by Western sources will be vastly different to what Russian sources say, and it's in Ukraine's best interest to keep these numbers a mystery. Best estimates, though, place the numbers very low at only a few hundred in each of the various locations, like in Kherson and Crimea. This small, decentralized approach is vital to partisan action going unnoticed and hard to track. With this in mind, we can break down partisans into 2 separate groups. The first group would be helping indirectly. Think of farmers pulling Russian vehicles away, or civilians giving information about Russian activity to the government. The second group is direct action partisanship, which would be directly combating Russia either through assassinations, direct combat, or sabotage activities behind enemy lines. The road from Bakhmut leads to a city in Ukraine called Slavyansk, where in 2014 they had 5 million rifles and machine guns stockpiled in the event that Ukraine wanted to hand out weapons to their population for partisan operations. It was Russia's fear of this strategic arsenal and the fear of having to fight an armed population that made them prioritize trying to capture this otherwise not strategically important location. And with all of this in mind, we can see here, thanks to the interactive map, that the majority of reported partisan activity has been located to the front lines, like those in the Kherson Oblast and Donetsk. While there is also partisan activity near the coastal regions of Russian-controlled areas, the most important areas of operations are those taking place in the city of Melitopol. The reason why Melitopol is so important is because of the strategic importance that the city has for Russia's war plan. Melitopol is known as the gateway to Crimea and serves as a land bridge to Crimea. It's essential for Russia to control Melitopol if it wants to properly resupply their troops. One partisan from Melitopol, codenamed Savag, told the New York Times after the invasion that he was directed to a storage shed which contained high explosive, detonators, and weapons that he used against the Russian forces. These kinds of activities provide Ukraine a better chance to regain control of Melitopol, as resources will have to be diverted away from the front lines. As the conflict has continued, partisan activity has only increased and has become a vital tool for Ukraine in their fight against Russia. One of the most important factors to consider is the intelligence they provide. Human intelligence has been crucial for Ukraine. In an interview with members of the resistance movement in the Kherson region, they speak on how they helped coordinate strikes on Russian positions.
The boys climbed to the rooftops and watched. They watched the movements of the Russian columns and reported it back to the army, who then dropped bombs.
Even with a vast amount of resources the Russian military has at their disposal, this is one thing they don't have. This isn't to say no one is collaborating with the Russians, which we'll get into in a minute, but the mayor from here stated that only 8 from his village were able to collaborate with the Russians. The most organized of these Ukrainian partisan groups is the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces, which is believed to have more than 130,000 volunteers. The Territorial Defense Forces were even elevated to a full-fledged division of the country's armed forces after they were successfully able to destroy some Russian armored columns early in the war. So what exactly is a partisan and how is it different from an insurgent, which we were fighting against in Iraq? According to a counterinsurgency expert and professor at the Royal Military College in Canada, Eric Quillette, the difference is perspective. Countries that are fighting what they feel is a just war will call the enemy insurgents, and in some cases, like in Ukraine, they're called partisans because they're fighting against a technologically superior enemy that is deemed to be morally wrong. Regardless of what you call them, the end result is the same. These are ordinary people fighting back against an invading force. In Melitopol alone, a bridge was blown which hampered Russian supply lines and their efforts to resupply in southern Ukraine in December, and in January, an ammunition depot was destroyed in the state enterprise Hydromash. It was reported that there were explosions for 5 hours, meaning this was a sizable Russian depot. To get an idea of just how debilitating these attacks are on Russian logistics and supply lines, on July 30th, 2022, Ukrainian partisans destroyed an electrical box that controlled the key railway junction near a city in Luhansk. This simple sabotage made it impossible for the Russian armed forces to deliver ammunition to an entire section of their front lines. This railroad line runs the entire length of Russia's front lines in the area, and their army is dependent on it functioning. They've also shown themselves to be capable of assassinating important Russians in the region. A Russian collaborator, Kuleshov, was gunned down by a Ukrainian partisan cell in Kherson, while Russian Lieutenant General Yakov Rentsev, commander of Russia's 49th Combined Arms Army, was killed in an artillery strike thanks to the partisan information. Not only do Ukrainian guerrilla fighters have the home field advantage, but they've been actively training for these kinds of operations with US Special Forces before the invasion even happened. The opposite of a Ukrainian partisan would be a Russian collaborator. These are Ukrainians who have sided with the Russian occupation. Sometimes they're forced at gunpoint, and other times they do so willingly. This started becoming a bigger issue once Ukrainian armed forces began recapturing large areas of land back from the Russians, including the Kharkiv and Kherson region. For instance, of the 80 or so people who were on the executive committee in the Izium city, which was priorly occupied by Russia, only about 4 decided to stay and help the Russian occupation. One of them even recorded a propaganda video for Russia. Zelensky and the Ukrainian authorities now have to decide what to do with Russian collaborators as they recapture their land. The New Yorker spoke with Karevchenko, the prosecutor in Ukraine who works with the Ukrainian Security Services, the SBU. His job is to identify and charge suspected Ukrainian citizens inside the newly liberated territories who have collaborated with the Russians and their occupation. Zelensky created a new law, the Ukrainian Criminal Code Article 111. This article governs collaboration, which is defined as any purposeful act that harms the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine's state. In order to effectively conduct these kinds of operations, the relatively new communication apps Telegram and Signal are being utilized. When I was in Iraq, we had technology to triangulate and pinpoint Iraqi insurgents on their cell phones that they were using, or partisans, or whatever you like. But we would raid suspected enemy houses based on their communications. Today, Ukraine has some technological advantages for their partisan activities. On Telegram, there have been a number of different groups that have been created whose sole purpose was to collect intelligence and report it to the Ukrainian military. One of these groups was called Russians Go Home, which was created on the same day of the invasion in the city of Kherson. This was a small operation of only 20 people and speaks to the decentralized nature of partisan warfare. However, even a small group like this was able to produce results, evidenced by the video in which General Zaluzny posted showing a column of Russian vehicles being destroyed by a Bayraktar TB2 UAV 3 days after the initial invasion, thanks to these partisan efforts. That attack was only possible because of the intelligence that was cultivated thanks to the partisan Telegram groups. Another app which is being used is Signal, because of its strong end-to-end encryption and the fact that it wasn't created in Russia like Telegram was. Signal allows rapid communications and is a critical communication tool for those fighting against the Russian occupation. This is why Russian forces who find Ukrainian citizens with Signal even installed on their phone are instantly suspected partisans. This is, of course, not the first time Signal has been used in this way. ISIS has also used this encrypted messaging service and speaks to the larger point of how insurgencies operate in the 21st century. Modern wars require modern communication methods that are essential to those who do not have access to military equipment, and they're turning to readily available apps like Signal and Telegram. Additionally, Russia has experienced dealing with partisans as evidenced by their treatment of the Chechens. Russia does not utilize a hearts and minds strategy, but rather a campaign of grinding down the country's resolve. So this is when we talk about the retaliation of Russia against the partisans and what strategy they've taken. This is evidenced by the atrocities committed to the civilians in Bucha and other cities in Ukraine. Russia is using brutality as a deterrent in hopes of defeating the Ukrainians' resolve and deterring any possible partisan groups. Besides physical violence against civilians, Russia is deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure like power plants, which has been targeted an estimated 1,000 times since the beginning of the war this January. Russia is attempting to destroy the Ukrainian morale and hopes to make them submit to Russian rule. However, this does not seem to be effective, as it's had the opposite effect given the continuation of partisan activity in regions that are in deep Russian control areas of Ukraine. The Kremlin has to worry about partisan attacks happening on their own soil of their own motherland now. In August 2022, a car bomb took out the daughter of one of Russia's most notorious nationalists and ideologues, Alexander Dugin, which Ukraine denied involvement in, but it shows how resistance to Russia is spilling over into their own country. It's possible this was a Russian partisan group and was internal fighting, but it goes to show the power that non-uniformed operatives can have and wield in war. It is important to understand that partisans alone will not win the war. While they're doing essential work in hindering Russia's ability to conduct war, there is supplementary force. There are also no indications to suggest that partisanship in Ukraine will slow down, that it will only stop once the war has ended and will be a constant threat for Russia to consider. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy, over and out.